Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bill Traynor. I'm the Dean at Georgetown Law, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome all of you to Georgetown University Law Center as part of the 10th annual celebration of pro bono. When we were approached by the ABA about hosting this conversation with Justice Kagan, Honorary Chair of the 2018 National Celebration of Pro Bono, we were happy to accept. We're, of course, honored to be hosting Justice Kagan, who's a true champion of pro bono work and of the cause of justice. So thank you for speaking here, Your Honor. And we're also delighted to host this event because this celebration of pro bono resonates with the mission of Georgetown Law. Those of you from the ABA who may not have been to our campus, when you go to the library and you walk in the door, you see our motto, law is but the means, justice is the end. And that philosophy, that motto, that mission defines us as an institution. We start the orientation for the first year students with service projects. It's a mission that resonates through our classrooms, through our clinics, through our support of summer fellowships in the public interest, pro bono work after people graduate. We have a low bono law firm for our graduates that we started with DLA Piper and Aaron Fox. All of these things really resonate with that mission of law is but the means, justice is the end. But we take particular pride in our commitment to pro bono. The faculty is deeply committed to pro bono work. And when our students arrive, we challenge them at the very start of their career with our pro bono pledge. So incoming JD students are asked to pledge to commit at least 50 hours of law-related volunteer work before they graduate. And second-year transfer students are asked to do 35. And our LLM students who are here for a year are asked to do 20. And then at graduation, we recognize the students who do 100 hours or 200 hours. Last year they did collectively more than 32,000 hours of pro bono work. And this year we're ahead of that pace. We're almost at 15,000, and it's still October. So our commitment to pro bono really is part of what defines us as an institution. And so, there are many, many events in this auditorium, but this is one that has a particular importance for us. So welcome to Georgetown, and for all of you from the ABA, thank you for all you do in the public interest. So it's now my pleasure to introduce George Buck Lewis, the ABA Pro Bono Committee Chair. So a few words about Buck. Buck is the chair of the Appellate Practice Litigation Group of Baker Donaldson. He works from their Memphis office, so I guess now you're at the Knoxville office. He's held numerous positions, leadership positions in our profession and his community. He was president of the Tennessee Bar Association, president of the Tennessee Legal Community Foundation. He was appointed by the Tennessee Supreme Court to chair the Tennessee Access to Justice Commission. And he spearheaded the development of online tnjustice.org, a website that allows people from Tennessee to seek legal advice from volunteer lawyers, which led the ABA to establish kind of a broader national online platform. And he's been a member of the ABA Pro Bono and Public Service Committee since 2014 and was appointed its chair in 2016. So as we're celebrating pro bono, Buck's commitment to pro bono work and the difference it can make is inspiring. So it's a privilege to welcome and call to the podium Buck.
Thank you, Dave. Welcome, everyone. What a great looking crowd, great afternoon. So great to see so many students in this audience. It gives me hope. Dean Trader, thank you so much for that introduction and for hosting this event. We know that you moved a few things around on the chessboard so we could be here, and we are really grateful that you could make this beautiful facility available for this event. It's my honor to welcome you all to this event because it marks the 10th anniversary of the National Celebration of Pro Bono. A little bit over 10 years ago, then Committee Chair Mark Schickman had the idea to create a locally focused week of pro bono events to bring attention to the good work of attorneys all over the country who provide legal services all year long, and also to highlight the great need for all attorneys to provide pro bono service, which is, after all, enshrined in the preamble to the rules of professional conduct. We're all supposed to do pro bono and devote time and resources and civic influence to the cause of equal access to justice. Like so many great access to justice ideas, this was a refinement on an idea that first took root with the Chicago Bar Foundation. And from the beginning, this has been a collaborative effort with providers, law schools, law firms, state bars, local bars, specialty bars, and ethnic bars all across the country and in other countries. And it has now reached the point where we had last year and have again this year over 1,300 events as part of our month-long celebration of pro bono. The media attention, thank you media, that is given to pro bono during the celebration is instrumental in bringing pro bono to the attention of the public, which is, after all, good for our profession as well. We're so honored to have Justice Kagan here as our honorary chair of the 10th anniversary of the celebration, and grateful to both the Justice and American Bar Association President Bob Carlson for their participation in this special conversation. It's now my pleasure to introduce Bob Carlson, the president of the American Bar Association. And Bob is a shareholder with the Butte, Montana law firm of Corrett, Black, Carlson, and Mickelson. He has served in many national and state bar leadership positions, including president of the State Bar of Montana. He was chair of the ABA's policy-making body, the House of Delegates, which is the second highest elected office in the ABA. He served 2 terms on the ABA Board of Governors. He's held other leadership positions, including a multitude of positions with various sections, and served as the board's liaison to several entities, including the Commission on Homelessness and Poverty. I was in the room in August when Bob made his initial remarks to the ABA House as president of our association. He pledged to build on the ABA's national leadership to encourage pro bono and legal aid for America's most vulnerable clients and communities, including veterans, homeless youth, and disaster survivors. And Bob has certainly stood by that commitment in a variety of ways. Just a few weeks ago, asking lawyers throughout the country to go on our online pro bono website, ABA Free Legal Answers, and help the victims of Hurricane Michael in North Carolina. We're appreciative of the ABA support of the committee, but more specifically, so appreciative to Bob for his support of pro bono legal services. Please give a warm Georgetown welcome to Bob Carlson, president of the ABA.
Thank you, Buck, and thank you, Dean Traynor, for your hospitality. I appreciate Buck's service as the chair of the ABA Standing Committee on Pro Bono and Public Service. Your leadership has enabled the ABA to expand on its prominent role to promote the delivery of volunteer legal services to our most vulnerable neighbors. On behalf of the American Bar Association, I'm pleased to welcome you to this event. It is indeed a privilege to have with us this evening Associate Justice Kagan of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Kagan is a graduate of Princeton. She received her master's in philosophy from Oxford. She then attended Harvard Law School, where she received her JD. Justice Kagan had the honor and privilege of clerking for 2 legendary judges. First, Judge Abner Mikva on the U.S. Supreme Court, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, and then for Justice Thurgood Marshall at the United States Supreme Court. After briefly practicing at a law firm, Justice Kagan became a law professor at the University of Chicago Law School and later at Harvard. She then served in the Clinton administration as associate counsel to the president and then as deputy assistant to the president for domestic policy. After this time in Washington, Justice Kagan served as the dean of Harvard Law School. She was then nominated and confirmed as Solicitor General of the United States and then was appointed as Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. Justice Kagan has been a supporter of pro bono and public service throughout her career, and we are happy to welcome her today as the ABA celebrates the 10th anniversary of the national celebration of pro bono. We appreciate that Justice Kagan has taken time out of her very busy schedule to be here with us today, and we are especially grateful that she agreed to serve as the honorary chair of the 10th anniversary of the national celebration of pro bono. Please join me in welcoming Associate Justice Kagan.
Thank you. Please sit down. Please, thank you. Not every audience gives you a standing ovation before you say anything.
Indeed.
Thank you, Bob. And thank
you.
you, Buck, and thank you, Bill, wherever you are. So it's great to be here. It's always great to be at Georgetown, where Dean Traynor and I go back a long way. So it's always good to reunite. And what a happy 10th birthday.
Yes, it is. It's
Yeah.
made even happier because you're here and we're able to have this chat or visit amongst this great audience. We have obviously students, faculty, we have ABA volunteers, ABA leaders, all.
Who started this idea 10 years ago?
Well, you know, I wish I had the answer to that. Buck might have the answer.
Is he here? Okay.
He's not.
Well, in his absence. Good idea.
So, Justice Kagan, you've spent time in both the private and public sectors, but most of your work has been devoted to public service. And would you share with us what...
Is that what I'm doing now?
Yes, I think that is true. Pro bono, too. So, what influences in your life started you on the path to public service?
Well, I guess my first was my father. My father was a lawyer. He had a teeny tiny firm. Sometimes it was one lawyer, sometimes it was two lawyers, sometimes it was three lawyers. But, you know, basically, he was a lawyer who put a shingle up and did whatever came in the door. And it's hard to make a living that way, actually. And but not with, you know, he managed. He was fine. He was good. And always he devoted a lot of his time to other activities. Especially to community activities. We lived in New York City. For those of you who come from New York has a very elaborate set of community boards and community organizations of various kinds. And my father was always going to those kinds of things, very interested in land use issues on the west side of Manhattan. But, you know, mostly was I think he was the first person that was like, you could be a lawyer and you could do your work and make your money, but then you had a certain set of skills and you could devote them to your community, to your neighborhood, to the people around you. And so he was my first role model on that.
So were there any specific influences in law school and then throughout your career that encouraged you and pushed you in this direction of public service?
Well, you mentioned two people who I was very lucky to fall under the spell of, and those were the two judges that I worked for, Judge Mikva and Justice Marshall. Justice Marshall, you all know, and I'll get to him in a second. Judge Mikva, maybe fewer of you know about his career. It was an amazing career, really. He was in government most of his life, but in all three branches of government. So he did private law for a while, and then he was elected as a member of the House of Representatives from a real swing district. So he kept on like winning or losing by 32 votes. But notwithstanding that, he served for I think 5 terms. And then President Carter decided it was just really too stressful and made Judge Mikva a judge. And then at a certain point in time, President Clinton asked Judge Mikva to come to the White House and serve as his counsel. And that was how I got to the White House, because Judge Mikva then called me and said, "Do you want to work for me again?" But he was this person with this amazing spread of governmental experience, knew everything about how every organization in government worked, and was sort of passionate and enthusiastic about it all, and communicated that to all the young people around him, took great delight in mentoring people, very much including me. I owe him a lot. And then, of course, Justice Marshall, to be in that chambers was something pretty special. I think, to be a clerk at the Supreme Court is a pretty exciting, sort of heady job. But to be in the Justice Marshall chambers, I think you just felt as though there you were with an icon of American history, an icon of American law. I think the greatest lawyer of the 20th century, certainly the lawyer who most advanced justice in the 20th century. And he was a storyteller. He was an amazing storyteller. And one of the things that he told stories about, honestly, was himself. Because they were good stories. I mean, he had lived an extraordinary life. I clerked for him when he was older, when he was, I think, knew that he didn't have all that many years left, and he was a little bit looking back, and we were the lucky beneficiaries of that, because we would go into his chambers every day, and we would talk about the cases and do all the things that clerks and justices do. And then at a certain point, we would finish, and he would segue into storytelling time. And we learned about his childhood, and we learned about his years at college and at Howard Law School, and working with Charles Hamilton Houston, and then at the Legal Defense Fund, really crafting the strategy that led to the eradication of Jim Crow, that led to Brown v. Board. And it was an extraordinary life. I mean, he was both a trial lawyer and an appellate lawyer. He did civil cases, he did criminal cases, he did every kind of law that there was. He did it, of course, in the most horrendous circumstances. He would crisscross the country, and particularly the South, in places where he couldn't go into a restaurant, he couldn't find a bathroom, he was often confronted with real physical danger. And just sort of hearing those stories and hearing about how one man attempted in his entire life to make a difference and to promote justice. And you can never hope to do anything like anything remotely like that, but it still can serve as a kind of model and a sort of guiding light and inspiration. And so I felt very lucky as a quite young lawyer to have fallen in with him.
Well, if I might say on behalf of everyone here, I think you've done a pretty good job of following along some of that path.
I don't know. He
Got
might
a little
have
ways
some
to go,
complaints,
but
I do want to say, though, I guess I'm making up a question on my own. I'm sorry about this, but I mean, so here, we're talking about pro bono and public interest and public service and all of that. One of the things that I learned as a law dean, and I'll bet Dean Traynor would agree with me on this, one of the great things about being dean of a law school is that you meet a lot of great alumni. And so I got to know just a ton of people who had followed different paths and had crafted different kinds of careers. And one of the things you learn is that people can do work for the public, do pro bono in all kinds of different capacities and all kinds of different ways. You have the people who sort of give their whole lives to it, right? And the people who work in public interest organizations from the moment they graduate law school and to the very end, or the people who serve in government in the same kind of 100% always way. But the numbers of those people are actually dwarfed by people who create different kinds of careers, who go in and out of different sorts of organizations. So sometimes they're working at law firms, and then they'll take some time off, and they'll go work in some other, a prosecutor's office, a public defender's office, a public interest organization, go back and forth. And then there are the people who spend all their times in the private sector, but manage, even as they're doing that, to do very significant amounts of pro bono work and in ways that really make a difference. And there are the people who contribute to the public by doing amazing acts of philanthropy, which, if you're a dean, you want to meet those people. But there are just all kinds of ways to serve the public, and it's not. I always thought when I was deaning that that the worst thing for students to think when they were in law school was that you had to kind of make an on-off choice at the beginning. You either had to go be an angel, or you had to decide that the private sector was your cup of tea. And it's just not the way the world works. And people make differences in all kinds of different places. And of course, paid work can often be good for the public too. But there are all kinds of ways to help the public and to serve the public. That's a great thing about the legal profession.
Well, you mentioned your time at Harvard. While you were there as dean, the number of hours students dedicated to pro bono more than doubled, and there were some significant changes that were made in the way that occurred. So a two-part question. What changes are you most proud of from your time at Harvard? And what advice do you have for others on increasing the support for public interest students and for pro bono work during law school?
Well, I was listening to Dean Traynor, Dean Traynor earlier talk about all the hours that Georgetown students spend doing pro bono work, and I was reminded of my time at Harvard. I can't claim credit for this. My predecessor actually put in place a mandatory pro bono requirement. And I forget what it was. I think it was something like 50 hours. Would that make sense? Is that sort of consistent? And that was the minimum. And that had been put in place just a year or two before I got there. And then what we discovered was that people really, it wasn't a question of, making sure that people did it, because people just did it and more and more and more and double and 10 times and 20 times. And so when Dean Traynor was reading his numbers, I'm no longer the dean of Harvard Law School, thank goodness. But I felt like saying, if the dean of Harvard Law School were here, I'll bet he would challenge Dean Traynor to a contest. Roughly schools of the same size, and they could, how many hours, do you do? How many hours? When I used to get to the end of the year, and this was what we really had to do, the real challenge for us once this requirement was in place, and we had sort of geared everybody to thinking this way, the real challenge for us was to create the opportunities for people to do meaningful pro bono work. Some students would just go out and find stuff. But for other students, it was important. We wanted to make sure that these were terrific opportunities, that they were educational, that they were meaningful. And so that was the real challenge. And I had a great staff of people who worked on it as in Georgetown, a very large student body. So it was hard work, but I'm so glad we did it. By the time I got to the end of every year, we had a day where we would give out various kinds of awards and prizes for various sorts of things. And one of the things that we always did was to recognize the 10 students who had done the most pro bono work. And these were ridiculous numbers. I mean, it was like 2,400 hours of it was like, do you guys ever go to class? What are you doing? It was really breathtaking, and it made you very proud. And but it's hard for a law school to make sure that people have the opportunities to do that. I mean, the other thing, obviously, that I know that Dean Traynor has worked on and that I worked on is just getting the resources that are necessary in order to support people when they come out of law school to work in public interest organizations or in government, where they're taking a very significant, sacrifice. They're making a significant sacrifice in terms of the money that they'll receive, and most law students come out with big loans, and the only way that they can do that is if you find some way to forgive the loans or something equivalent to that. And I've always felt exceptionally lucky. I was the dean of a law school with a lot of resources and a lot of generous alumni who understood how important it was to give back. So it's I recognize it's a lot harder for a lot of other deans, but certainly, if you can and to the extent you can, having law schools make it possible for their students to go into some often low-paying jobs is crucially important.
So you're the only member of the current court who did not previously serve as a judge. And although you've frankly had an incredible array of other experiences in academia and in the practice,
Some people used to say I couldn't keep a job.
Well, you kept getting promoted.
No, okay. Nicer way to say it. Okay.
What in your experience do you draw on the most in your day-to-day work as a justice?
Well, I'll give you two jobs. The first is kind of obvious, which is before I was a justice, my immediately preceding job was as Solicitor General. And that's a job where you think a lot about the Supreme Court. All you do every day is think about how to convince 9 justices of the court to agree with the government's position on various things. I used to think the only difference was that one was trying to convince 9 justices, and my current job is trying to convince 8 justices. But it's a job where you're sort of steeped in the Supreme Court. The Solicitor General actually supervises all appellate practice in appellate courts throughout the United States, but the main job is to think about Supreme Court business, what the court is taking, what the court should be taking. I used to go to, I used to go to every argument that anybody in my office participated in, and that was about 3/4 of the arguments. So in a single term at the court, I would go to about 60 arguments, watch the court, think about what they were interested in, think about the things that they were thinking about, write briefs to them. So think about their procedures. So by the time I got to the court, actually, even with a fairly short stint as SG, but I was sort of in the mode of thinking about the court, and that was exceptionally helpful, especially considering that I hadn't been a judge. In some ways, I actually think that the best single preparation for being a Supreme Court justice is being Solicitor General, because there are a lot of differences between appellate judging and judging on the Supreme Court. And the SG is the one position other than the court which just the entire focus is on the court. But I would say less obviously, I think about what I used to do in teaching all the time. And this is teaching, it's not deaning. But the reason why I think about teaching all the time is when I write opinions, I think about how I would have taught something. And I find this the most helpful way to figure out how to write something. Because, when I write, I'm trying to communicate some often very arcane subject matter in a way that people will understand, in a way that not just the expert lawyers will understand, but the parties will understand, informed citizens will understand, people who just want to pick up a Supreme Court opinion. And you'd be surprised at how many of them there are out there. I sometimes get these letters from people, and I think, really, you read that? But the objective is that you shouldn't have to be an expert to understand what this institution is doing and why it's doing it. And the only way I can think about how to do that is to think about how I used to teach. That I would sit at in my office, and I would say, okay, I have this body of material. I'm going to walk into a classroom. Everybody in the classroom is going to be very smart and very interested, but they're not going to know all that much. And how do I convey this body of material in ways that they'll understand? How can I convey this body of material in ways that will stick with them? And I kind of think I'm doing the same thing when I write an opinion. So I would say that my experience teaching has proved to be, surprisingly to me, really quite relevant.
So let's turn a bit to matters of the Supreme Court in general, and particularly issues that are on a lot of people's minds these days, and that's whether or not you worry about the court either becoming too politicized or at least being perceived as too politicized, and how much of a danger do you think there is about that?
Well, I think it has to be a concern. We would, what the court most has going for it, the most extraordinary thing about the Supreme Court in American history is that people believe in it, is that it has this legitimacy, it has a kind of credibility, so that even when it does things that many people disagree with, that very considerable blocks of the population disagree with, that other political actors, that other branches of government, the actors in other branches of government disagree with, that they nonetheless say, but we're going to follow what the Supreme Court tells us to do. And it's not even a question that they would do anything but that. And that's one of the glories of our country. And it's something that's a very precious thing that the court has to be very careful to protect. And I think that to the extent that the court looked as though it were just an extension of the political process, that would be a very dangerous thing, and maybe especially so in these days when the political process is itself so divided and so polarized. Now, I think when people accuse us of being political, I think that they don't understand a lot of what we do. If you look at a typical year at the Supreme Court, all but about well, first off, we decide half of the cases unanimously, which is really quite extraordinary given how hard these cases are. We don't take cases unless they are extremely hard. And notwithstanding that other courts have divided on these cases, we are able to get together to talk them through and decide them unanimously. And then I would say in another 30 or 35% of the cases, they're not unanimous, but they're kind of lopsided, or they're very scrambled in terms of anything that anybody would predict. But one still has to admit that there are a certain number of cases, whether it's 10 or 12 or 15 each year, where people find us not so scrambled and not so unanimous. And, there's a kind of, where people say, oh, there's the Supreme Court again doing its 5-4 thing, and doing its 5-4 in ways that seem predictable or in ways that seem to reflect the party of the president who nominated us. Now, as to those cases, I think it's important for people to understand that when we divide on those cases, it's not because we're partisan in the way that people in Congress are partisan. It's because we have certain judicial philosophies, thoughts about how to interpret the Constitution, thoughts about how to interpret statutes, thoughts about what the constitutional commitments mean that do lead to some predictable outcomes. And so it's not partisan, but you can see how people would look at that and say, well, you know, what's going on there? And is this just politics by another name? Which would, I think, be very damaging for the court and for what it does in our society. So I think we all, every single one of us, should think about that. I mean, you know, you're a judge, and in the end, you have to figure out what's right, and you have to decide the case in front of you in the way that you think that the law requires. But there are ways of avoiding conflicts where it's not necessary to have one. There are ways of taking big cases that may create big conflicts and making them smaller and trying to figure out what in this case we actually do agree upon. And I think that that's a pretty important thing for the courts to do. And again, maybe especially in these polarized times, when a case comes in and we think, if we'd have decided this big issue in the case, we're going to be very divided ourselves, to look and see if there's something smaller that we can agree on, if there's some greater consensus that we can achieve consistent with our constitutional and other legal responsibilities. I think that that's an important thing for the court.
You've talked often about the importance of reaching across the aisle and the importance of putting yourself in the other person's shoes, and also about civility. So maybe you could, particularly for the law students here who are looking forward to a career, talk about how they can learn from that mindset and how they can learn from, even though people people of goodwill have strong differences in philosophies, how they transcend those in the day-to-day life so that you can have a strong relationship with your fellow justices.
Well, you say that with conviction, as if you mean it, and that these are important things, and I mean it too. I hope I say it with just as much conviction, because I think that this is an exceptionally important thing, and maybe too few people in educational institutions, among other places, realize how important this is. I think, you know, we make progress by listening to each other, and by listening to each other across every kind of divide, divides of ideology or methodology, or in the case of political institutions, politics. You know, I guess my own view is that echo chambers are pretty boring places, and not just that they're boring, but that you tend not to learn all that much in them. If nothing else, when you listen to people who have very different views of your own, if nothing else, you at least are able, from that back and forth, to learn how to defend your own views better, to learn where the weaknesses are, to learn how to plug those weaknesses. But who knows, you might even learn that you're wrong about some things. And there's nothing wrong with that, you know, to learn that you're wrong and to learn that another person has a pretty interesting point of view that maybe you should borrow some of. And look, I think, you know, pretty much all over people, you know, look, I don't, I'm sure there are times where I don't listen hard enough, but I think we do a pretty decent job at the court on that. And I do think if you look around this country and think about other political institutions, think about educational institutions, I think that this is the great challenge, is to get people to listen to each other, to get people to work together to find some common ground, if nothing else, to be respectful and civil to each other. But it should be more than that. It should be like, let's find some ways to collaborate and cooperate. Let's find some things that you're right on and I can agree you're right on and you can agree I'm right on. And I think we could, in this country, be doing a better job on that.
At commencement ceremony at the University of New Mexico School of Law, you encouraged graduates to follow your rule of three: pride, passion, and pro bono publico. How do they interrelate? And what are some specific examples you can give the audience about how you followed them in your career path?
You know, I'm sitting there listening to this question, and I have zero memory of
It's that
what,
YouTube
of
and
what
stuff,
I
you know.
might have been talking about. And honestly, really, the rule of 3 Ps, I don't know. I mean, I must have given one too many graduation speeches that year. I'll make something up if you want.
It's up to you.
Yeah, why not? You know, I think probably what I was doing was talking to a lot of people like you who were thinking about what to do with their lives. And I always thought that people in law school, too many people in law school, just kind of were on a track. You know, they thought everybody else is doing this, and this is what everybody tells me to do, so that's what I'm doing. And they didn't think hard enough about whether they really wanted to be doing that. What was that, pride and what?
Okay, so now you made me forget. Pride, passion,
Yeah,
and
passion.
pro bono.
You know, so I mean, I think that the idea was, you know, you should go to a job. You should try to find a path which does fill you with a kind of pride that you're doing what you're doing, and that does fill you with a sense of passion and urgency about your work. And the best thing for any job is that you wake up every morning and you think, I mean, maybe not every morning, but but most mornings, it's like, I can't wait to go to work because I am doing something that I care about, and I'm doing something that I think makes a difference. And that fills me, I'll give you another P, fills me with a sense of purpose, all right? Yeah, we could just keep on going and play these, yeah. You know, and pro bono, I think, I mean, I did a lot of talking when I was dean, when I was talking to law students about pro bono and making sure that that was part of every legal career, no matter what you were doing. You know, and you could do it 100% of the time, or you could do it 10% of the time. You can do it a lot one year and a little the next year, but to think about in your career that you should be giving something back for this incredible gift that you've gotten, which is, you know, you go through one of these law schools and you come out with skills and you come out with a kind of education that there are people all over this country who would die for, and to use that in some way. Not just for yourself, is, I think, you know, first off, it makes most people a lot happier than when everything's just about me. And even if I'm wrong about that, it's still what you should do.
Yeah. So during your confirmation hearing, you promised that if you were confirmed, you'd try to go hunting, something you'd never done before. And you made good on that and made a comment that at least it broadened your own experience set. So how do you think about the experiences of the other justices and their backgrounds, and how that interplay makes you work together on most days as a team, but on some days as a team that doesn't always get along but seems to reach a result?
Gosh, well, I'll tell you how this hunting thing came about. So when I was going through the confirmation process, in addition to the hearings that everybody sees on TV, you spend a lot of time going from office to office to office in these courtesy visits, they're called, and talking one-on-one with senators or with their staffs. Always with senators, sometimes one-on-one, sometimes with their staffs. And they take the opportunity to talk to you about things that they're concerned about. And for me, number one on the list, everybody thinks number one on the list is, you know, how many times were you asked about abortion? But it turns out that was so dwarfed by the concern that people had about my views on gun rights and guns. And people can't ask you questions like, what do you think about Heller? And, they know that they can't do that. So they try to find different ways of exploring the same areas. And for me, it was, I can't tell you how, I went to 82 of these courtesy visits, and one after another, Democrats and Republicans. People would say, do you own any guns? I'd say no. Has anybody in your family ever owned any guns? I would say no. Have you ever hunted? No. Does anybody in your family hunt? No. Do any of your friends hunt? I mean, it was really pretty pathetic. And I was talking to a senator, one of the senators from Ohio. Idaho. It's like one of those,
Yes. We know where it's at.
Yeah. One of the senators from Idaho, and he had a ranch, and he used to hunt a lot. And he was telling me about hunting, but he was telling me in a very serious way, in a way that I completely respected, about how important this was to the people he represented, and how there was a concern that I could never understand the place of guns and gun culture in the lives of the people in his state. And I said to him, Senator, I said, I grew up in the middle of New York City. This isn't what we did on the weekends. But I completely understand what you're saying, and it's just an experience I haven't had the opportunity to have. But if you would invite me to your ranch, I would love to go hunting with you. And this look of abject horror came over his face. And the White House aide who was next to me, they send these White House aides with you, and she's just like, I'm just going to disappear from this sofa and drop in the hole in the ground. And so I realized I had gone a little bit too far, and I said, Senator, I didn't really mean to invite myself to Idaho hunting with you. But I'll tell you what, I will make you a promise. And this was seriously, literally, the only promise I made in 82 courtesy visits. I said, I'll make you a promise. If I'm lucky enough to be confirmed, I will ask Justice Scalia, whom I knew to be a very avid hunter, to take me hunting. And when I got to the court, I told this whole story to Justice Scalia, who, among his other many, many gifts, had a wonderful sense of humor. And he just cracked up. And he said, okay, we're on it. And he took me to his gun club, and he taught me to shoot, and he taught me gun safety, and he taught me, everything I needed to know. And then he was a very generous man as well. I mean, he had this bunch of hunting buddies who, they had been hunting together for years, and probably the last thing that they wanted was me tagging along with them. But they invited me all the time, and I went 2 or 3 times a year with him and with other members of his family and friends of his. Mostly we did it, we shot birds out in Virginia near Richmond. But we went to Mississippi together to shoot ducks, and we went to Wyoming once to shoot deer and antelope, which I didn't like nearly as much. And it was I actually quite liked it, which I think some of my East Coast friends are horrified about. But it was a good lesson in they're just this is a big country, and we grow up in so many different ways, and what's second nature to me is somebody else can't imagine doing, and vice versa. And but your question made me think, what should I have demanded that Justice Scalia do, And I'm not sure I have the answer to that.
So do you get recognized in public outside of the district?
Sometimes, less and less. When I was nominated, and you go through the confirmation process, and you're on TV doing those hearings, people do recognize you, and you think your whole life has changed. You think, oh my gosh, I can't like stand in line at Starbucks without 1,000 people wanting to take selfies with me. Selfies, I don't think selfies are a good invention, really. But you know, eventually, people forget what you look like a little bit. So, or sometimes, or maybe they forget what you look like, and maybe they just think she's been on the court for a while. I somehow like when I was nominated, my favorite story is that I walked out of my the apartment building I was living in then, and somebody across the street, down the block, a ways away, shouted, "You go, girl!" And I thought that was pretty cool, you know, but it doesn't happen anymore. So,
Well, how about maybe a funny story about not being recognized?
not being recognized. You're winking as though you know a story.
If you ask my wife, she would say I do that all the time.
Like something I did, and I'm thinking,
Yes. Why didn't they notice? Yeah.
you know, nothing's coming to mind.
All right. Well,
Somebody, I was having dinner at a restaurant about 6 months ago, and somebody came up to me and said, "It's such an honor to meet you, Justice Ginsburg."
so that would qualify.
I think, okay, we're women on the Supreme Court. Got it. We're not all Justice Ginsburg. We can't all be Justice Ginsburg.
So free time, if you have any, what do you do besides not hunting now?
I do normal things. I go to movies. I'm a big sports fan. I go to sports events. I do a fair bit of reading. What do you do, Bob?
Well, in my spare time, I interview justices of the Supreme Court, but you know that's about it these days. So, a couple of, I think our time is running short. A couple of.
They're done in the front row. They're nodding.
So I have time for two, right? Okay. So
better be good.
This is a pretty good one. So. Every time we have a new nominee for the court, there's the question that gets asked. Primarily, should justices have life tenure? And if you could give us what you think are the advantages and then maybe the disadvantages of life tenure for Supreme Court justices.
Yeah, so are we retroactively applying this?
Because
you
can answer
I
it any
just
way you
got
want.
there. I'm pretty happy. Seems
so-
like a good job.
Yes.
I'm happy with it being life
Yes.
tenure. I don't know. It's a hard question. I mean, obviously, the reason for life tenure is a very important one, which is that it makes people independent, and it means that none of us are thinking about the next job we'll have because we won't have a next job. And nobody's ever going to be in a position where they need anything from anybody ever again. And that's a really important thing to ensure that the judicial branch is independent. Now, could you do that with sufficiently long terms? 18 years seems to be the going proposal. Maybe. So I'm not saying that there's nothing to proposals like that. I think what those proposals are trying to do is to take some of the high stakes out of the confirmation process, and certainly to the extent that worked and that people could be a little bit, could feel as though no single confirmation was going to be a life and death issue, that would be a good thing. So I think it's a balance among good goals, and I wouldn't pretend to have the answer to it. And thankfully, that one is not our call.
So, any closing thoughts to this audience of lawyers who have primarily devoted their careers to public service and pro bono, or for the law students who are preparing to start, hopefully, that type of career path?
Well, to the law students, you heard about my 3 Ps. Which,
Sorry.
so just take that as your lesson for the day, yeah? No, for the law students, do something that that fills your life with purpose and meaning. Those are the best jobs day to day, and they're the best jobs when you kind of look back at your career and wonder why it turned out that way. And don't plan too much. Law students are they're into planning, and this has to come before that, and that has to come before this. Be alert to serendipity in your lives. All the best things that I've ever done in my career were unexpected, were not planned, were just somebody dropped an opportunity in my path, and I was smart enough to see it. And so be alert to just sort of opportunities that appear out of nowhere, even though they're not on the path. And really just ask yourself, would this be fun to do? And would I find this fulfilling and meaningful? And if the answer is yes to all of those things, go do it, notwithstanding what the plan says. And so that's my advice to law students and to all those who have spent their life doing pro bono and public interest work in the ABA or elsewhere. I guess I would just say thank you.
Thank you. So, Justice Kagan, thank you again for being here with us tonight, for helping us mark the 10th anniversary of the National Pro Bono celebration, and for your lifetime commitment to public service and pro bono.
Thank you very much, Bob, and for you too.
And we do have a gift or two for you, so just hang with me for a second. As a small token of our thanks for you, hopefully you'll put this in a place of pride in your office. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, and we also
gosh. This is why I come to these events.
So,
How great.
that's the Georgetown Law Streetscape.
There it is. You know it well. Thank you so much, Bill. Thank you.